how these things are unfolding, especially with your visits to the areas that are outside the control of the regime. But I think also because in your role as a journalist, you actually have very much similar dilemmas in terms of also access, but not humanitarian access, but access for information purposes and all these things. So, what is this dilemma for you? Does it ring a bell?
I mean, on that one, obviously I have a sort of clear bias. I mean, I have been to the regime side once, and I wasn't given another visa, and they didn't seem to like me much when I was there, I have to say, either. They were pretty unhelpful in stopping me doing my job, whereas when I've been on the rebel side, until the takeover of ISIS of large parts of northern Syria last year, I was pretty much helped to see both sides of the story. I mean, my first atrocity I saw was a rebel atrocity which I was taken to by rebels. They were able to do that. So there's a bias there, which leads me to think about how the regime tried to manipulate me and how it tries to manipulate the media in terms of access. So, if you've written anything pro the regime or defending Assad in any of the major Western newspapers, you'll be given a visa within a week. I mean, that's simple as that. You'll be in Damascus day after tomorrow. I mean, that's maybe not the day after tomorrow, but certainly there's a clear favoritism in that. And if you report critically, you will not get access. Whereas on the rebel side, there's very minimal control of who is being allowed in on the rebel side, until they started kidnapping people, which is its own, I suppose, control. But that's a slightly different thing. And that makes me think about the whole aid issue and indeed the humanitarian issue, which is something that I've discussed with many people inside Syria who feel like the people in Kafr Nabil do. Plague on all your houses, because for this very simple reason, that the regime, I have to say, from my perspective, its only goal is regime survival. I mean, it said that itself actually in the past. Its only goal is regime survival, and everything else is turned to that end. And so it has been very smart in the way it's used both international law, such as it is understood, and the humanitarian impulse, together playing off each other to support its own goals. So by using the international sort of block on action through the Security Council through its support from Russia, it can therefore prevent any sort of United Nations intervention in what it's doing. So therefore people say, well, what can we do? Well, we want to give humanitarian aid. It's a natural feeling. Everyone wants to give money. Governments help those poor people that we see on our television screens. But they can then use that humanitarian aid and the restraints they put on the World Food Programme and others to help the regime, because it's the regime areas that are getting the aid overwhelmingly, and they can then use that within those areas to play military games. We will starve you out if you do a deal with us. If you surrender, we will give some of this food aid to you in Homs or Yabrud or these other Yarmouk, particularly of course Yarmouk, these other places under siege. So curious enough, the humanitarian impulse is being used to help the people who most people think are the people who are causing the humanitarian crisis in the first place. And so it's not surprising that this cynicism that we see in Kafr Nabil has come about, and people saying, so what is this humanitarian law about?
You wanted to say something, or you want me to move on?
I can just say something very quickly on this about how that kind of manipulation is almost becoming a standard. It's almost becoming a norm. But what's not standard is to have a now 2-month-old Security Council Resolution 2133 that explicitly talks about breaking the siege and about 2139 that explicitly talks about access, and to have an organization that I shall not name, but working from Damascus, tell me that in the last 2 months there has been a total drop in their ability to send convoys to the different areas.
I want to add one quick point, which is that I think also we have to analyze what has been happening on the northern part of the country in terms of delivery of aid, because NGOs have been delivering to a small extent, but from the Turkish border. But how it was going, that's something that I think we need to understand, because My understanding is that there's a place called, Point Zero, where they drop the food and just run back to the Turkish side. So then the whole idea of where the aid is going, who's taking it, are the civilians the ones? I mean, again, I hope the good civilians, the good, citizens, getting this assistance or not. So that's one. The other point is that. Even if a UN agency is supporting logistically with these NGOs cross-border, you will never hear about it. So, I mean, my point is that there could be things that are happening, but not necessarily, so much on the surface. Yeah.
Can I just come in there?
Sure.
You're absolutely right. And in theory, and certainly the Turkish border areas and the towns like Gaziantep are absolutely jam-packed with aid workers who are coming up with plans and doing it. But there's a very simple point here. If you go to some of the villages and towns in northern Syria, they're not short of food. Why is that? It's because the people can get to Turkey and buy food, or be given food, and pick it up themselves. So when those guys are sending in food to their point zeros around northern Syria, these aid agencies, they're obviously, it's a highly complicated and dangerous operation. They're taking in food and dropping it. But they're taking it to places where the people can already go and get food
in Turkey
already. Yeah. What you have to get to food, difficult places, the places under siege, the places in, the places in Hama, particularly Hama and Homs, leaving aside Damascus, the Damascus suburbs, Ghouta places. Those places, you can only go in if you have armed protection. Where's that armed protection going to come from? It's got to come from
the rebels.
Not the rebels, because you can't work with the rebels, right? Because you can't work with those armed guys. You have to get Western military force. You have to have a humanitarian corridor. Again, that's been run by the people we know about it, the United Nations. Can I just come out to the Tahrir tomorrow? I don't know if other people picked that up on that. When you were talking about since the UN resolution, this organisation, which we both know, saying that it can no longer operate as freely. I mean, basically you're saying, that's just as I understand, that this is punishment. This is punishment by the regime to the international community. If you start putting pressure on the United Nations, we will stop humanitarian getting through to people that you care about.
This is what we notice, and it goes back to that point of impunity and the point of no accountability. There is a Security Council resolution, and things have gone worse in the last 2 months from a humanitarian.
Just one more point, which is that the other thing is that there's also this misperception that there are no cross-border operations happening in Syria. I mean, the food is coming from across the border in Lebanon, and we had cross-border coming from Turkey, to an area controlled by the government, but from there, we had the ability to do cross-line, but we just needed the food supplies into Al-Hasaka governorate to stock up our warehouses so that we can start delivering to different parts. And there were some assistance that got into contested areas and to opposition areas last month, which is during the month of the Security Council resolution. One more thing is that there's certainly lack of political will, because the chemical weapons team was able to go to many places and had access to many areas where food was not able to, we were not able to send food to. If we were able to tag food to the chemical weapons team, we would have fed many people. But there's certainly, lack of will on all sides of the equation. And, all sides are not, 100% clean. We had our food stolen by many, by all sides, and, distributed the way they want. So,
now this is like a good opportunity for me to, step a little bit and try to look at, the complex of everything that is being done by the international community. And it's basically, multi-governance level. There's things happening regional, international, but also local. There's public, private. But I think there's several things we could, take as three broad ideas about it that I would like to talk to you about. So the first thing is that the response so far appears to me as immunological. What I mean is just like a system reflex trying to contain a crisis. The fundamental link between territoriality, order, and sovereignty, that is the fundamental building block of the Westphalian system, has been broken in Syria, and the system is responding as a reflex without any rational plan to actually contain the consequences through humanitarian work, through refugee work, etc., etc. And so, but that created a situation whereby we end up understanding the humanitarian as a substitute for political action. And so that, we are, we're desperate, we want to act, and then the way we think we relieve our conscience, so to speak, is, we deliver aid. And so this tension between the humanitarian and the political, for me, seems to characterize, and it came out many times through the conversation, and there is an element of it which is Syria specific, but there's also, more systemic and endemic parts of it. And so I was wondering, how do we actually divide what is systemic and what is Syria specific? And if we could actually even point out what are those constraints that is forcing us into situations where every single time we're paralyzed politically, we behave humanitarianly. We humanize the issue. We turn it into a question of victims. So I don't know who would like to. Tamara, you seem to be.
Yeah, because Human Rights Watch has worked. Human Rights Watch has very clearly divided its areas of looking at Syria from a political, humanitarian, and justice perspective. And by political, obviously, it looks at activity at the Security Council, at the Arab League, bilaterally, at the level of the EU, etc. And one thing that struck us is how on Syria, the Friends of the Syrian People conferences suddenly, from one conference to the other, turned into a pledging conference by donors for humanitarian assistance. And there was almost no talk of supporting Syrians to reach a political solution. And we've all, I think, followed the sad developments of the Geneva talks 1 and 2, including something that hasn't come up in this discussion yet, which is protection and the issue of detainees. We've all spent a lot of energy talking about delivering aid, but we have not tackled the issue of detention and, reports of a black hole in Syria that seems to just swallow people into detention, and also reports of certain armed opposition groups taking people from coastal villages as hostages. We haven't tackled that. And for us, again, we are a human rights and a rights-based legal organization. The answer for us lies in looking at accountability and looking at entities like the Security Council to bring answers in the form of, for example, imposing an arms embargo on Syria, an arms embargo to anyone who's implicated in gross violations, the government and certain groups, so asking certain countries that fund and support certain opposition groups that are documented to be abusive to stop doing that.
But Tamara, I have to object because historically we know that if you start from impunity, then usually the politically victorious is the one that decides that it's criminals. And so when whoever is going to win side is going to win, if there's ever, is going to decide who is the criminal, who is not the criminal. So the question of impunity may end up on the practical level indeterminate in certain ways. So starting from it is not going to give you a place which is outside the need to make a political choice of some sort.
But no one's winning today, honey. No one's winning, and everyone's getting away with murder, literally. And You know, the joint special envoy, who I learned resigned yesterday, Mr. Brahimi, is actually someone who looks at the issue of justice and accountability as an either-or. So he's someone who typically would want the pragmatic efforts towards a political solution first, and then we will think of justice. I happen to come from a different school, and I represent an organization that believes that unless you have the seeds of justice in a political deal, you will not be able to build a future that will hopefully patch a country back together. I know it sounds idealistic, but the only way to actually try to patch a country, looking at what happens in 20 years and not just today, is for mechanisms of truth, of admitting the atrocities that happened, of trying to find justice for those whose justice have been denied, in order hopefully to reconcile.
But I mean, I'm going to try to articulate a little bit. Go ahead, please. Sorry.
I agree with you completely. You know, I was one of the first judges on the Yugoslav tribunal. But the problem is that you cannot get those who are condemned until the end of the war, usually. So, in a way, this would not really deter very much if we look at it as deterrence. We did hope that it does, but and the Yugoslav tribunal was the most successful because they got the 94 people who have been accused, all of them. At the beginning, we thought we won't get any big fish and perhaps small one. But the problem is, how would that affect, to some extent, the problem of the emergency? I agree that it should be, there should be no deal of peace without justice at the end. And in Yugoslavia, there was talk at Dayton, but it didn't prevail. But that would not solve the dilemma during the conflict. After the conflict, or in order to bring it to an end, it's a different question.
See, I feel that contradicting you.
No, but you do.
But at the time of the Yugoslav war, there was no International Criminal Court, and now there is one. There is one that the Security Council can refer Syria to, and by doing that, it will allow the ICC not only to look at atrocities from one side, but from all sides. And that is the ghost that should lie in front of people who are today taking decisions of atrocities and giving orders to commit atrocities. It does not provide a political solution. At the end, we all know that there will be a political compromise that will snatch Syria out of this and hopefully move it somewhere. But if there is no element for future justice in this, it'll always be a faulty deal.
But I think one thing that comes to my mind when we're discussing this is there is a word that we're taking it for granted, and we as if we know what it means, and I think we don't, which is political. Because we could be using that word in a variety of ways. We could be using that word from the international relation realist idea of interest of states, the big powers and their dealings behind the door. So that would be one way of seeing it. But we could also see the political more as making a value-based judgment about a state of affairs that you want to be realized, globally or in the world. Or we could see it political as it's a choice in a political battle inside Syria, whether you want to support the regime or whether you want to end the regime. And so when you speak about political, what is it that you're referring to which one of those levels?
To most of them. It's no secret how complex Syria has become today. And it's no secret that, yes, you have on one side a government, and on the other side, you don't know who you have anymore. You don't know who you have, including everybody that supports that other side. And so I'm deferring to others who have more longevity in working on complex conflicts that have internationalized, because this is probably where we are in Syria now, to tell me how, or to tell us how then you reach a compromise with all of these multiple
But there
parties.
is a very powerful point or moment, I think, that I heard Abir describe when she said, you know, if we were tagging along with the chemical weapon teams, we would have done a lot of good work. And for me, this is exemplify a little bit of the tension and that I'm talking about. That yes, we end up, you know, addressing the situation as a problem of managing a humanitarian crisis globally. That's, you know, when we turn on the news and all these things, that's the only thing we hear. We address the situation as by managing it as a humanitarian problem. But then there's something that, you know, we could do and we don't do. And the example, I mean, it was a really powerful moment when she says, so I wonder, from your perspective as somebody who is paradoxically receiving all the attention, because we're addressing the issue as something in your domain, but that by doing that, we're actually weakening your ability to do work rather than, you know, helping you, because, you know, we're taking away any political backing. So you must be in a very, you know, how are you not frustrated with that?
Well, even this question is very complex, because on the one side, when we look that all the attention and the media coverage is going on the political process, and that the people who are suffering are becoming just numbers, and we are very afraid of the dehumanizing of the conflict, and the fact that at the end of the day, you know, we need people to survive this conflict so that they can have a role in the future. But at the same time, we realize also that we become extremely also nervous when everything that we do becomes the main focus, because at the end of the day, this is like, you know, there was always a term that I heard, you know, when I was working with UNHCR, from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees during the Iraqi refugee crisis. And he used to say this. He said, we are nurses, not doctors. We can deal with the symptoms of the disease, but the disease is political and the treatment needs to be political. In the meantime, we have to deal with the implication of this political disease. So I think a balance is important. We don't want to lose this humanitarian perspective, because at the end of the day, you know, we need to be funded. This is a very expensive operation. It costs WFP, for example, and I'm sure other agencies, I want to say that for every other agency, it is you know, the funding is a big challenge. It costs WFP 40 million US every week to provide assistance to people inside Syria and to the refugees who have fled to neighboring countries. And it's a machine. We have to, you know, constantly fundraise and make sure that we have, because when we don't get this 40 million every week, then it means that our food baskets, which we are giving to families inside Syria, like last month, have been reduced by 20%. And mind you, what I have seen firsthand is that when we give a food basket to a family of 5, it's actually not to the family of 5. It's being split with 3 other families. Wow. You know, they're splitting the food you know, with each other, because the needs are much higher than what we are doing. So at the end of the day, attention is good for the humanitarian crisis, so that we continue to put the pressure on the international community to continue funding. But this is not going to be a solution to the Syrian crisis, because there has to be a push on the political side as well.
Professor, how did we get to this point? I mean, this is not something that, you know, emerged in the Syrian question. It's something that evolved over...
Here the machine broke. And in fact, it broke already in the 90s, after the euphoria of the end of the Cold War, and everybody said, I mean, I think it was George Bush who said, at last,
a new world order.
The first war launched according to the Charter of the United Nations. But in fact, what happened was that it was used in a certain way. It was not a war according to the Charter. Even Secretary General then said that it was a war authorized by the UN, but was not a war of the UN. In other words, it was not a collective security operation. In fact, the UN has passed from the pretension of regulating and containing conflict to a kind of, I'm sorry to use this, as the street sweeper who comes at the end simply to clean the road from the results of the conflict rather than dealing with the conflict. The UN does not deal with conflicts any longer. From that period on, they only deal with the consequences. And I cannot blame a humanitarian branch of the UN for not taking the political aspect into consideration, because it's not within their mandate. They are there to help the victims, not to, they don't have the means of dealing with with the essence of the problem, which is how to stop, and if you don't stop, how to stop, how to prevent the conflict from coming into being. That's the essence of collective security. You have such a deterrence collectively that nobody would dare to break the rule, and if it does, you intervene early enough to stop it. They are not doing that. They are letting the parties fight it out, and they are taking care only of
the consequences. Wow.
So that is the break in the machinery. And here it is not the rules, but it is the machinery which was supposed to apply the rules and to make sure that they are respected, which has broken down.
Wow.
This is kind of return to the Cold War, isn't it? I mean, that's
Excuse me?
This is partly a return to the Cold War, and that's one of the issues.
Yeah.
The Cold War, as far as it was at the time, had a winner and a loser. And the whole security infrastructure of the world changed. Countries fell out of their Cold War postures into different alliances, and the balance of power changed. Yes. And what you might call the soft targets for the liberal democratic project, as we in the West saw it, the Eastern European countries that were sort of historically and educationally and culturally could be assimilated into the Western world. Sort of they were allowed to fall into that world, but then these other by contrast, American supported dictatorships around the world, in East Asia and so on, were also sort of fell into this liberal democratic mold by sort of osmosis. But then you're left with this rump of states, and what happens to them? And what it seems to me to have happened to them is that actually, the world is a peaceful place, more peaceful place. It's a terrible thing to say, but there's a great statistic that fewer people died in conflict in the first decade of the 21st century than in any decade of the 20th century. But what sort of happened is, because of this sort of the security infrastructure that was being set up since 1990 around the world has been for this sort of for this gradual progression, and suddenly Russia's come and said, okay, no further, it stops here. There's a freeze. You're not having any more. You're not having Syria. They were sort of, Libya was a bit of a sort of dubious case because it was sort of Russian, but sort of not really, a little bit crazy, and so they let that one go. But as we're seeing in Ukraine, as we're seeing in Syria, and we're seeing in Central Asia as well, there is, Putin has decided that thus far no further. And what has then happened is that all the sort of pent-up conflict of the rest of the world that hasn't happened in the last 10 years has sort of got sucked into Syria, and it's become the sort of like the pool to which all other forms of, you know, inter-ideological conflict and international conflict has been sucked into that one small place.
I mean, you make me very optimistic. So I had 4 questions in my mind, but I think I would like to, since we're running a little bit out of time, so would like to open the floor for discussion. So there's going to be a moving mic. You know, raise your hands, introduce yourself, and please be brief, because we're going to give. And so the way we're going to go about it, we're going to have 2-3 questions and then final words to the thing. Go ahead.
Okay, my name is Mohammed Khalil. I'm a reporter. سؤالي يعني أولا لما حضرتك كنت بتقدم مستر ريتشارد كنت يعني ذكرت أو يعني ما أعرفش مين اللي كتب الانترودكشن بتاعته وقال إن هو غطى الانتفاضة في مصر وليبيا وسوريا. يعني في الحقيقة أنا ليا يعني اعتراض على كلمة uprising هنا. يعني الوضع في مصر وليبيا مختلف تماما عما يحدث في سوريا، لأن يعني ما يحدث في سوريا الآن هناك يعني صراعات دولية كثيرة وأطراف دولية كثيرة تصرف المئات من الملايين لمصالح شخصية وتاه معها الشعب السوري. ولكن ما حدث في مصر كان ثورة كاملة على رئيس يعني لص وسرق ونهب ثروات الشعب. وما حدث في معلش خلينا كم وما حدث في ليبيا أيضا ثورة كاملة على رئيس نهب ثروة الشعب وبددها. يعني الوضع في سوريا الرؤية لم تكتمل بعد. يعني احنا ما زلنا حتى في مصر هنا تائهين، لا نعرف يعني ماذا يحدث في سوريا ومن ينفق على من ومن يساند من. والسعودية تدخلت وإيران تدخلت وروسيا تدخلت، فيجب التفريق هنا في التعريفات. يعني ده مهم. يعني
أنا رأيي سؤالك مهم والتفريق، ولكن أولا نحن لسنا في صدد المقارنة بين مصر وسوريا. ثانيا أنا برأيي من ناحية من ينفق على من، السؤال مطروح في كل الحالات بما فيها مصر. لذلك يعني لن أدخل في هذه المقارنة، وأحب أن أخلي الموضوع معلق، علما أنه أنا إلي فهمي الشخصي للوضع في سوريا، وكونه في نهاية الأمر حركة تحررية بكل معنى الكلمة اللي كان لها سوء الحظ أنها تتاخذ بهالمعمعة الدولية. أسئلة ثانية؟ More questions? Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you, Hani. It's not really a question, it's a comment, and I'd like to know how the table will react to that. I see the very interesting opposition between Abir and Tamar. The United Nations, a subsystem of the international system set up to preserve the state and the prerogatives of the state, as opposed to an NGO which in fact wants to ignore the state to some extent. So you have here 2 visions, in fact. And when access was not given by the Security Council, as we said, George, in fact, of course, the Libya lesson was on the mind of those who could take a decision, but in fact, it was also, in a way, not to completely undermine the state system in the region. Because in fact, if you ignored completely the borders of the region, which are already ignored, look at the millions of refugees which have lowered the borders between Lebanon and Syria, between Syria and Jordan. All of this could affect tremendously the state structure in the region. In fact, you pronounce the word realism. Realism. We are here in a sort of realism, but would realism mean keeping exactly the state structure as it is, the system of states in the region as it is? So I think that in this discussion probably we could go beyond the humanitarian dimensions, because the humanitarian dimensions, in fact, analyzed on their own, in fact, would not get us very far. This is a very complex situation. It is about, we talked about Syria as if, okay, again, from a realist perspective, Syria. But there are people in Syria. There are components of Syria, and they also interact with components in other states in the region. So how do you see this? How do you see the consequences of the conflict in Syria for the equilibrium in the region?
Thank you, Dr. More questions. We'll take, two more, and then we'll.
أتمنى أن يسع صدر حضراتكم لهذه الكلمات. أولا تتحدثتم عن قوانين وضعية ونسيتوا القوانين الاستثنائية. في وضع بيحتاج البلد لقوانين استثنائية اللي كان نخرج من هذا المشاكل، وهو سوريا. زي ما خرجنا مثلا من مشكلة مرسي مع الإخوان، كان لازم الشعب ينزل، ده حاجات استثنائية إطلاقا، وخرجنا من المأزق والحمد لله. فسوريا لازم، ولا ينفع أمم المتحدة، ولا ينفع مجتمع دولي، ولا ينفع قوانين العالم كلها، لازم قانون استثنائي لكي يحل مشكلة سوريا. وكان نفسنا فعلا الترابيزة أو المؤتمر الحالي يضع حل لهذا المشكلة. القانون الاستثنائي موجود بس غايب عن الكل او محدش عاوز يطبقه.
شكرا.
القانون الاستثنائي خدت بال حضرتك، اولا معلش معروف مين معروف مين الظالم ومين المظلوم. ليه بشار ما يسيبش الحكم ويمشي؟ ليه؟ حسني مبارك 30 سنة خدت بال حضرتك، واحترم شعبه وتوكل على الله ويعني معلش وكان ده حاجة استثنائية منه برضه. يعني كان ممكن حسني مبارك يظل في الحكم ونوصل لأبشع حاجة زي سوريا وأكتر. خدت بال حضرتك؟
تمام، شكرا.
وشكرا
مش عاوز آخر سؤال كان في حد هنا؟
My name is Pauline, PhD student here in Cairo, working on the Sudanese refugee and refugee status in Egypt. I agreed with Dr. Awad's comment. I was about to say so, but he said it. So I was a bit, at the same time, curious and at the beginning and disappointed now to see that a bit everyone stayed in his position, and maybe because also we didn't go beyond the humanitarian aspect of the crisis, we just, everyone stayed in his corner defending its kind of usual position. So that was more of a comment. And a question for Tamara. I really liked everything you said until you mentioned the ICC, and I don't know if it's much of a question, but especially because you've mentioned Sudan, I guess you've been working there, and I'm still surprised how, not as you working for Human Rights Watch, but you personally can still support the idea, even though you've been working in Sudan, and we know that the ICC order against Bashir has not changed anything on the situation on the ground regarding protection and human rights and anything related to protection. Thank you.
In response to the questions, or more generally?
Well, we have a deficient system. Because the machine, as I said, it's not so much the rules, but the machine which is supposed to put them into effect did not function. We didn't examine the alternative. The alternative is humanitarian intervention, meaning that a state which would intervene by force and supposedly to help the victims. Now, there are many people, particularly in the West, who defend this position. And even the UN, they adopted this resolution about responsibility to protect, etc. After Rwanda, particularly. But of course, I think you mentioned Libya about the intervention, and there they invoked formally. But every time there was this kind of a laissez-faire type of intervention in the name of humanity, there was always a very specific intention of the one who intervenes, and it always ended up by changing the regime and not necessarily to a better one. I mean, Libya is not much better. No. Not to speak of Iraq. Iraq was a very important case where the United States intervened without
UN Security Council authorization.
Without Security Council, and now even Obama almost admitted that it was illegal. Where is Iraq? Well, it is there still, but much worse even than under Saddam Hussein. So, unfortunately, we need greater imagination to find a way of dealing with such situations. Ibrahim mentioned the state, the Hermetic state, the Westphalian state, etc. But we didn't find another way of dealing with peoples, with communities, making abstraction of the state. I mean, unfortunately, up to now, the governance of the world, we don't have other alternatives. How can we render the state more translucent rather than hermetic, and more responsive to such humanitarian concerns, without completely taking off the source of power from the state? We don't have, unfortunately, this is the great dilemma. This is the great dilemma, to find another order that permits us to not completely to make abstraction of the state, but while admitting that it is the agency for public interest in general, to render it, in fact, responsible. That if it abuses the power of those who act in the name of the state, abuse the power, can brought to justice. The system of criminal international justice is still budding. I mean, somebody mentioned Sudan. I mean, here we have the president of a country. Now we have also Kenya, the president of Kenya. He is accused before the ICC. How far does this take us?
Well, the question is, this international criminal system is still imperfect. It's politicized, but this is what we have today, and it's the result of huge efforts. By the same token, we can also say, well, the Geneva Conventions are always neglected and, stepped on. Do we drop them? We don't drop them. We keep calling for them. And so, imperfect as it may be, at least the ICC is there. And we often discuss this internally at Human Rights Watch. What is the alternative? Let's think of an alternative where you would set up a special tribunal. Realistically, who will pay for it? Who will hire the people? Who will put funds into it? It's there. I want to say a quick word about.
Excuse me.
Yes, please.
I agree with you. What I mean, we have elements.
Yes.
But we have to build
You
on
know,
them.
it's imperfect.
Yes.
It's definitely imperfect. One thing about me bullying my friend, my all-time friend from the UN.
Which I have to explain one thing. Actually, Tamara is the reason I'm here today because I think she suggested my name to Dr. Henry. So actually,
we're old friends.
So we're
actually.
old friends. So we're coming here.
We're old friends, but today
It's a ruse.
I have the luxury of being able to tickle aid agencies through Abir. The luxury because my organization's raison d'être is to document and expose, and we love funfair, and we love the scandalous, very hit-me-in-the-face kind of titles. We love doing that because we do not have one bag of flour to deliver. And that's why we have the luxury of being able to tell people in their face what we think of them. And in doing so, we don't actually ignore states. We deal with states all the time. We talk to officials all the time, of course, to tell them that they did this and that and the other, but we deal with them. We hold them accountable, and we give them routinely balances and checks and balances of their respective human rights.
Abir.
Just to add to that, I think it is the role of NGOs for advocacy is very important because it is still important to put the pressure on the UN, on NGOs, on all parties on the ground to raise the bar on delivery. But I will disagree with you, Doctor, on I think the statement that the UN is there to preserve state and the NGOs are there to support the opposition. I think it's really an overstatement. That is not at all the purpose of the work of the UN inside Syria. Assistance there is blind. It's needs based, and we hope that we reach everyone who needs this assistance. And if you look at the Libya case, it was a different, when we had the tools and there was the Security Council resolution that was the cross-border. I don't know how you would have characterized the UN assistance. Was it in support of the state or in support of the people, of the opposition, or of the people? I think that humanitarian aid agencies really, and I'm saying this from experience in different emergencies, have no role to play politically. They just want to meet the urgent needs wherever it is, and I think that there's a lot of shortcomings. I mean, it's not perfect, it's not even good enough, but it is meeting, there are 4 million people who cannot survive without this assistance every month.
Thank you, Abir. Richard, please.
I'd like to take issue with something Professor George said, if I may. Of course, you're totally right that the Iraq conflict, the Iraq war, the invasion of Iraq, overshadows this whole process, and who knows where we would be if that happened in 2003. But that sort of who knows what would have happened also works every which way. We can't really compare Libya with, say, humanitarian intervention failed in Libya because it's still a mess, because we don't know what it would have been like if there'd been no humanitarian intervention. There was already a war going on, there was already fighting, there were already deaths. You could argue if you hadn't had humanitarian intervention in Libya, you'd now have Syria and Libya. You'd now have something akin to Syria. Whereas if there'd been humanitarian intervention in Syria much earlier on, liberal intervention, whatever you like to call it, maybe we wouldn't have this situation. But we don't know. We can't really say that. And we also can't say that humanitarian intervention is always leading to regime change. Humanitarian intervention that is authorized by the UN is often about regime change, because if it's to keep the regime in place, the regime itself is asking for help. So you have the French going into Mali. No one complains about the French going into Mali and driving out Al-Qaeda. I mean, hardly anybody does anyway. I mean, and you don't hear the voices of complaining about neo-colonialism when France sends in its army and disappears a very nasty bunch of people in a matter of 2 weeks. So this is something that shouldn't just be thrown away as if we know all the answers. It's probably too late for that sort of intervention in Syria now. It's too late. But I think Actually, I'd like to take up your point, if I may, on that point, that there is still a role for the international community to try and work out a solution. In fact, solution is probably the wrong word. We're not going to have a solution. And then we're not going to sort of like, it's not a disease we're going to sort of expel from Syria, but a way of making things better for Syria while its horrible trauma plays out. I saw one analysis and spoke to an analyst who was a Syrian analyst who saw these things in this time. He said this is going on for 10, 15 years, whatever. So rather than looking to solve the crisis now, we have to find some way of persuading participants to make it less bloody and less violent, and some way of managing the war to make it less destructive for civilians. And I think that's currently the way forward. I don't think America is going to come in and solve the crisis with drones and bombers. I don't think. I mean, Britain just gave up, and Britain had a foreign policy which it just abandoned overnight, and just disappeared with the vote in Parliament. So I don't, these things aren't going to happen. But you can. I would suggest going back to my original list of priorities that each component has, of which actually one is humanitarian, and say, if these are the various actors' goals, how can they be met? Which ones do we want to meet? Do we want even to try and meet some of these goals? Which ones are legitimate, which are not legitimate? And then work around those to minimize the civilian sort of fallout in the next 5 years, because that's what we're looking at.
Wow. Thank you, Richard. I have to say that I was hoping that we will end up coming out from this conversation by removing the humanitarian and the humanization from the Syrian question to actually address it on different terms. But apparently this is something that we're going to be stuck with, and from my perspective, unfortunately. So I would like to thank you so much for being so generous with your time and with your talent, and I'm really grateful for you. And I would like to thank Asma and her team, who actually made a wonderful job preparing for this event logistically, and I ask you to give them a applause. Thank you so much. And sorry we took so much of your time. This event is adjourned. Enjoy. There are some refreshments outside.